break. And we are moving now to session 2. So we will deal now with how do we deliver essential services and goods to the people living in these spaces of vulnerability and informal settlements. I give the floor without further ado to Stephen. The structure is similar to what we used in the first session. So Stephen, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Bear with me, trying to share. Okay, can everybody see that?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay. All right.
Now we can see it. Perfect.
Okay, so post-COVID recovery action plan, we're looking at session 2, policy areas 4, 6, and 7. So services, food consumption and distribution, data, telecommunication, and information technology. All right, so bear with me. Okay, so we've already discussed this, so I won't waste time on that again. But once again, we've got the 6 thematics around the recovery action plan. Very briefly, I won't spend a lot of time here. It was a good article when I was looking around for graphics. This is looking at from the health sector looking outward. You can see the SDGs and the positive effects of SDGs kind of on the outside, and the kind of the internal structure of how your health sector would have to operate within the umbrella of the rest of what we were discussing, as far as their aspect, which obviously is a key component to what we're doing here today. Something to look at later in more detail. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. Also, it looked like a pretty good article, pre-COVID article, I might add. Okay. I wanted to start with, there was some discussion and there were some comments prior to this validation workshop about my use of the word institutional and barriers. And there was I think some confusion about what I meant by that. So I wanted to touch on a very important kind of overarching concept, sort of the connectiveness of everything, essentially. So the socio-natural, and by that I mean society, culture, and the natural world, tapestry threads can be pulled to affect change. When the connections are understood, the change is relatively predictable. When change is relatively predictable, it is controllable within a set range anyway. And that kind of control can overcome anything. So or nearly anything. So you have these PESTLE is a problem solving. I was looking around to see if anyone had worked on this before, and this is the closest thing I could find out there. Political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. These are all the main structures of society. And under each one of these, there's hundreds of little nodes. And when I talk about barriers, I mean institutional barriers, or barriers that are social, or barriers that are cultural, barriers that are legal. So when I talk about overcoming barriers, I'm talking about getting rid of the inefficiencies that stop the systems from working. So this makes it look really clean. So that is, and then there's resistance to change. I believe I mentioned before, there's momentum, the society and cultures, the collective desires, expectations, and I'm down here at this bottom line, natural and scientific hard limits, national and political momentum. There are expectations that are pushing forward. And so when we want to affect change, we have to nudge them and tease them off the path that they want to go, because the world doesn't want to change. It already has a momentum, and then getting it to shift from that is something that requires subtlety. I'm not sure if this is probably a pretty simple, on the left side here, pretty simple diagram, economic, social, and environmental. And we're aiming for the sustainable in the middle. And that's where it all balances out. But going back to the 6 parts of PESTLE, there are hundreds of little institutions that are there that can create efficiencies or inefficiencies. And over here on the right side, you see this mass. When I said there's a tapestry of all of these institutions working together, working well or not working well, in effect, it's more of a snarl of yarn. And this actually on the right side over there is, it's actually the computer network connections for all of these countries. But the snarl, institutional snarl, is very similar. And so when we want to pull a thread to affect a change, we're pulling all of it, is my point. That's all connected. And so looking at holistic answers that encompass all of the pestle, if you understand how the pieces are connected or have a pretty good idea, then you have predictable outcomes, and you can treat the causes of problems and not just treat a symptom and then be frustrated because it becomes another problem or that problem mutates into somewhere else. I'm going to go back to the energy concept really briefly, where we touched on if you did all that work to make an informal home into a really nice place, energy efficient, all of the services that you would want in a regular formal home, they would sell that. Most of them would sell that home to the formal market, and they'd go create another informal home somewhere else because they need the money. And that is kind of you can go too far and actually create additional problems that might actually be worse than the original one. So you've got to be really careful how you push forward, because when you pull threads, you're pulling all of the threads. You're not just pulling one. They're not separate. They're a snarl. Okay, so I wanted to touch on that. So policy area 4, services. Education, public health. The goal under services is that essential services are supplied to residents safely and adequately, overcoming the challenges of pandemic threat. That's the general goal. And under that, we had 5 targets, and under those, many actions. We want health services provision to be sufficient to meet the public needs. Emergency service provision is also sufficient to meet public need and has to be able to use those transportation networks to get to the people, which goes back to the transportation networks and the built environment. Appropriate community level health education has to be accepted. That's going back to communication again, and to Spiro's comment. We need extra communication in these locations, extra education, extra hand-holding, more community support focused, likely more financial support. Those are the differences. They need more. Then financial well-being of the community is preserved, and the safety, values, and culture of the informal settlements are also maintained for their cultural identity. And you start breaking some of those things down, and they're going to start resisting, because the public there is a momentum to the people, there's a momentum to the culture and to the faiths. And if we have to solve the problem relative to the danger that they're facing, but we have to do it in a way that balances society and the risks at the same time, or it's just not going to work. All right, so moving on to policy area 6, food, basic consumption, and distribution. The goal here is to ensure that adequate and safe manufacturing and distribution of food, basic consumption goods, and medical supplies get to the people. Under that, we have 4, we broke it down to 4 target areas. Once again, many actions under those, which I did not put here. We need appropriate social distancing measures during the pandemic that need to be followed in the distribution process. It's very easy for the like open air farmers markets Christy was talking about before, can become great spreaders of disease, and they're social events. It's part of the social fabric in some communities to have these open air markets, and these can be very, very risky. So we have to find a way to adjust those and get that to be accepted by the community, so that we can fight against that particular threat. Social distancing and safety measures need to be followed for those in the food and basic production side, like meat processing plants. You get a lot of people shoved indoors right next to each other. In the United States, this was a big problem. And we had a lot of meat processing plants that just had horrendous pandemics, far worse than outside in their surrounding communities because of how they work. So we need to look at those manufacturing, the goods and food manufacturing production side, because there are extra risks there. And those can be in formal and informal communities. And that's obviously the food and the goods go to both. And the workers often come from the informal communities. 6.3, minimize corruption, black market profiteering, and critical worker shortages. On the first aspects, you've got there's going to be, when you have a demand, you are going to have more corruption. You're going to have black market profiteering. It's really kind of going to happen, but it doesn't have to happen to an extent that threatens the safety of and the responses that are needed to minimize and mitigate the damage. So it just needs to be carefully watched so that it's not getting out of control. To some degree, I've always thought the black market has a place in the world as long as it's small. I mean, there are no rule systems that are perfect, so you need a little bit of play in the system. So some of the imperfections actually are probably healthy, but it needs to be minimal, and it needs to be done in such a way that it's not threatening the rest of the communities, formal and informal alike. Probably greater once again to Spiro, this is probably a more emphasized problem in the informal communities. And that's probably the theme to the answer to your question, Spiro. It's all of these factors, or most of them, are going to be more within the informal communities, and thus the responses need to be tailored with that in mind. Local communities and authorities have to be prepared to deal with labor shortages. Because of the changes in how people can move around, what they can do, and where they can work, we need to understand that people are going to be sick, people are going to be afraid to work, people are going to have to work differently, and this is going to require this is going to come up with labor shortages, and that could potentially be turned into benefits for the informal communities who can potentially fill the gaps. And we're going to talk later, another cross-cutting theme about ways to do telework. And when we get to data, the data side of things, we'll talk about and the decentralization of employment when necessary in the severe pandemic could actually offset this to some degree. But local communities and authorities need to be ready to prepare for how they're going to handle that. And because informal residents have less resources in general, the authorities need to be ready to give extra support to these communities and even informal communities. They're lower income residents, that part of the sector of society that just doesn't have the resources to be able to handle a threat that hits this hard economically when they're unprepared. Okay, and lastly, 7. Okay, so basic data needs, telecommunication information. The goal here is that the people are empowered to cope with a pandemic by leveraging and making easily available the relevant information technologies. Mobile phone technologies should be utilized to their potential. I think there's a lot of ways. These can fill information gaps, give social, when we can't have as much social contact, we can boost the effects of digital contact, because we are social creatures and we need these social contacts. Once again, all these threads are connected. It's a snarl. Once you start adjusting how people live and how they operate, they're going to resist. And you need to produce outlets. We need to find ways that they can still have a life, and while also being safe. So mobile phone technologies are going to be helpful with that, as well as other digital technologies related to computers. boosting internet access throughout everywhere, essentially. Free internet access is probably a damn good idea. Once again, these are going to counteract these negative social and cultural effects, and they're going to help allow the authorities to give complete, accurate, and consistent messaging, probably helping to overcome the false narratives that are going to happen out there and the mistrust. As was pointed out, some people do, there's going to be some of that, and we need to be prepared to offset that. The creation under 7.2, that target, the creation of decentralized employment and teleworking options. Under the threat of a severe pandemic, maybe one worse than this, all of society would change. We would have we would have very decentralized employment. Teleworking would become the norm. We would never have meetings. We would only do Zoom meetings like this. And I mean, that's not the threat that we are under the COVID pandemic, but there could be a situation that we have to deal with at some point that is worse than this, where really extreme changes have to be made. And we as humans are capable of that. It's just going to be very painful. Let's see. And informal settlement residents have easy access to education and communication from a variety of sources. Teleeducation is is doable, and it may not be perfect, but we can get better at it. And under a severe enough pandemic threat or severe enough spikes, we don't really have a choice. We have to go that route because it's better to lose a 20% efficiency on your education than it is to lose a family member. And thus, we need to keep things in perspective and look either mobile phone or computerized technology, wireless access can handle these this education problem. It will not be hard. It will not be perfect, but it can be done. So I think that's basically it. Thank you very much. I hope I stayed in time there.
You stayed in perfect time, Stephen. Thank you very much.